Welcome to the PowerPoint lecture, Phrases and Clauses. My name is Margaret Students, and I'm going to be examining with you the phrase, the clause, and how those two guys are different from sentences. Before we look at phrases and clauses, let's make sure that we all understand what makes a sentence a sentence. A sentence is a group of words. We could spot that even if we didn't know anything else about a sentence. But the sentence always contains a subject and a predicate meaning verb. A sentence always begins with a capital letter. That's something we learned even in first grade. And sentences always end in closing punctuation. We always need some kind of signal to tell us that the end is there. And most important of all of these, a sentence has to make a complete thought. So now that we know what makes up a sentence, let's look at phrases. Phrases are also groups of words, but phrases are groups of words that do a particular job or perform a particular function in the sentence. They basically work like one word. They work as a unit. Phrases do not make complete thoughts. They're not punctuated and capitalized like sentences, and we have a lot of different types. I'm going to talk briefly about the two most common types of phrases, but we have more. Prepositional phrases we've already discussed in our parts of speech overview and in a couple of our other lectures. But remember that prepositional phrases are groups of words that begin with a preposition and end with a noun. Sometimes we have modifiers, adjectives in between, and lots of times we have those noun markers, a, an, or the, inside the prepositional phrase, and you can see some examples of those here: on the stairs, in the house, under the bed. Infinitive phrases are a lot like prepositional phrases, and we see them a lot, but infinitive phrases are formed by combining the word to, which by the way can be a preposition in other situations, plus the base form of the verb, what you would find in the dictionary. Sometimes a noun is stuck on the end as well. And here are some examples of these: to read, to sing, to give love, to beat Duke. So we have both infinitive and prepositional phrases here, and both of these types of phrases substitute for adjectives, adverbs, and nouns. Infinitive phrases substitute for nouns way more often than prepositional phrases do, but you see these quite often in your sentences. Now let's move on to clauses. Clauses are also groups of words, but there are some big differences between clauses and phrases. Let's look at these. They fit into two categories: main clauses, sometimes you'll hear them called independent clauses; subordinate clauses, and again sometimes you'll hear them called dependent clauses, and sometimes I'll switch back and forth when I'm talking about them, so don't let that throw you. As I said, clauses are groups of words, and both of these two groups of clauses, main and subordinate clauses, have subjects and predicates, but there's some big differences beyond that between these two types of clauses, and let's look at them. Let's start with the main or independent clause. A main clause, again, I keep saying this over and over again, it's a group of words, and it contains a subject and a predicate. Here is the interesting part. A main clause contains a complete thought. So if a main clause began with a capital letter and ended in closing punctuation, we'd call that clause a sentence, right? But sometimes we put several clauses together to make one big long sentence, and the capital will begin on the front end, and then we might not see the closing punctuation after a couple of clauses have appeared in that sentence. So just because a group of words makes a complete thought and contains a subject and predicate, that doesn't mean that it is a sentence. Now, when we join clauses together, we have names for those, and I'll be telling you about those in just a bit. Here are some examples of main clauses that I have for you. Will had a nosebleed. It's a sentence and it's a main clause. Now here's one of those long ones that I was talking to you about just a moment ago. Let's add a little bit more. Will had a nosebleed and he bled all over the bathroom. Notice I have my capital letter here at the front end. We don't have a period here, it's all the way back here. This is something we call a compound sentence, and we'll be talking about that in the next lecture. Here's another long sentence. Because he had a nosebleed, Will had to lie down. Here we have a complete thought. That's a main clause. We have another clause in front though. That's a subordinate or dependent clause, and we're going to talk about those next. Now we already know if we punctuate and capitalize them correctly, we could have main clauses serve as sentences. Subordinate clauses can never stand alone as sentences. Why? They never make complete thoughts. That is why. So instead, they do a job in the sentence just like those phrases I discussed earlier. They can substitute for adjectives, adverbs, and nouns. Doesn't that sound repetitive and familiar? How can we spot these subordinate clauses? Well, they always begin with either a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun, and I'm going to show you some of those in the next slide. In the parts of speech lecture, I showed you some of the subordinating conjunctions, and here they are again along with relative pronouns, and there are quite a few of these. That might be daunting if you're thinking, oh, I need to memorize these. Best thing you can do is keep a list of these together as you write or as you do exercises for a grammar class. Here are several examples of subordinate clauses. When I was young, I was very tall. I have the subordinate clause highlighted, and it begins right here with the subordinating conjunction. Here's another one. I lost my tooth because I fell down some steps. This particular subordinate clause highlighted in brown again starts with the subordinating conjunction because. You notice I have one on the front end here and then I have one on the back end here. Subordinate clauses can appear anywhere in the sentence. Why? Well, they're substituting for adjectives, adverbs, and nouns, and those appear all over sentences. So if they're substituting, they're going to do the same thing. Here's another example. The woman who works for the IRS is sitting at the next table. Highlighted in brown again, dependent clause. This one begins with a relative pronoun, and we can tell that this dependent clause is doing the job of an adjective. It's describing woman. And then finally we have one more back at the front end. This dependent clause starts again with the subordinating conjunction although. And this particular dependent clause is describing Cruella, who is very ugly. So to conclude, I've given you a brief overview of what phrases and clauses are and how we can identify them in sentences. We've also talked about how sentences are different from phrases and clauses. So make sure you are keenly aware of these differences and keep these terms in mind as you move on into identifying different types of sentences, which will be our next lecture.